This is Final Fight, a side-scrolling beat-em-up video game designed by Akira Nishitani and produced by Yoshihiko Okamoto and released by Capcom. Set in the fictional Metro City, the game lets the player control one of three Street Fighters: former pro wrestler and city mayor Mike Hager, expert brawler Cody, and modern day ninja Guy. The trio set out to rescue Jessica, Hager's daughter and Cody's girlfriend, when she is kidnapped by the Mad Gear Gang in an effort to get Mike Hager to turn a blind eye to the wrongdoings of the Mad Gear Gang. Final Fight can be played by up to 2 players simultaneously. Before the game begins, the player chooses between the 3 main characters, Hager, Cody and Guy. Each has his own fighting style and attributes. Final Fight consists of 6 stages or rounds, as well as 2 bonus rounds. Each round takes place in a different section of Metro City, such as the slums and the subway, with most rounds featuring more than 1 level. At the end of each round, the player will face a boss character unique to that round. The game was originally titled Street Fighter 89. Capcom wanted a sequel to their 1987 fighting game, but Okamoto wanted a game based on the Double Dragon sequel that was released in 1988. But when Street Fighter 89 was demoed at trade shows in 1988, it was not well received, as the game did not resemble anything of the original Street Fighter, and so this game was reimagined into Final Fight. Obviously, this turned out to be a good thing for Capcom, as Final Fight ushered in a new wave of dominance in arcade games for Capcom, and was one of the games responsible for the success in establishing Capcom as a force in sprite-based video games. You can still see some of the influences of Street Fighter in this game. The health bars, for example. Health gauges are displayed for both player and enemy characters, as well as each enemy character having their own name displayed. This style of life bar, with the yellow and red colour scheme, and the font used for the characters as well, would go on to become a staple of Capcom games, and a surefire way to identify the game as being one of Capcom's, even at a quick glance. The controls for Final Fight consist of an 8-way joystick and 2 buttons for attacking and jumping respectively. Pressing the attack button repeatedly when attacking an enemy or multiple enemies will cause the player character to perform a combo. The final blow of the combo can be changed to a throw if the player moves the joystick in the opposite direction just before landing it. The player can also perform jump attacks. Pressing the attack and jump button simultaneously allows the player to perform a special attack that strikes all surrounding enemies, but will drain a small portion of the player's health. Enemies can be grabbed simply by walking into one of them. When an enemy is grabbed, the player can perform a grab attack by pressing the attack button or perform a throw by tilting the joystick left or right. A thrown enemy can be tossed at another for additional damage. Items such as weapons, health recovery items, and items awarding extra points can be picked up by standing over one and pressing the attack button. Weapons have limited uses and will disappear if the player is disarmed by an enemy too much or when the player moves to a new area. The combat system was a million times better than that found in Double Dragon, the so-called king of scrolling beat-em-ups. Where Technos made an unintuitive, complicated fighting system, Capcom's approach was much more fluid and free-flowing. This allowed for more accurate control and balance in the fighting. But, and this is a small but, the ease of fighting in this game did allow the player to throw all the enemies into the same section of the screen and line them up, essentially making the combat a little less frantic. This was clearly something Capcom thought of, however, as their solution to combat this was to have loads and loads of enemies on screen at any one time. The screen can become full of enemy characters, which can overwhelm the player. This was truly impressive, especially when you see how large and detailed the sprites were in this game. At the time of its release, Final Fight was like no other beat-em-up found in the arcades. The look and sound of it immediately hooked you in, and with the simplified and much improved fight mechanics, it quickly became a must for all arcade fans of the genre. Capcom had clearly spent a long time in developing the game. As well as having great graphics and sound, the continuous screens were actually impressive as well. It's not like you would look forward to getting killed off, but when you see your character trying to blow the fuse out, it was less gruesome than Ninja Gaiden's continuous screen, but you knew it wouldn't end well if you didn't continue. The sense of relief on your character's face when you do continue and the knife drops from the top of the screen to cut off the fuse is quite amusing. I would venture into Joker's Amusements in Paisley on a weekly basis to play this game with my mates when I was a lad. The arcade owner had been good enough to place stools at this arcade cabinet, as a playthrough of this game could be about an hour, a long time for games of this type, and you better believe I spent many a 10 pence on this machine. The first time I got to the game boss, I misread his name. He is of course called Belgar, but I misread that as Belcher. I used to think, great, is this guy going to load up on Coca-Cola and pot noodles and come out and pass gas on us all? Yeah, it was funny at the time, and still is if you like toilet humour. Speaking of humour, my mate used to have me in stitches when he said that Hager's jump was like putting on this massive condom. And it does kind of, but when you're a 14-year-old boy, that is a kind of humour that you appreciate, I guess. Final Fight was, and still is, one of my all-time favourite games. The game is great in one player, but in two player, it's even better. It still provides a challenge, and is still addictive after 30 years. Just don't go playing it back to back though, as you'll end up with sore thumbs and fingers from all the button mashing. At the time this was out, I had just got myself a Sega Mega Drive and was disappointed to hear that it wouldn't be coming out on that machine. But it would be getting released on Nintendo's new 16-bit machine, the Super Famicom. At that point, I knew I had to get myself a Super Famicom just to play this game. And that's exactly what I did. A port of Final Fight for the Super Famicom was released as a launch title for the platform in Japan in 1990. There were some differences in the SNES version when compared to the arcade game, like the fact only 2 players were selectable. The game is only a 1-player version of the game. If you wanted to play as Guy, you would have to wait a few years until Capcom released another version of the game called Final Fight Guy. This would include Guy and Hagar as selectable characters. At the time, I thought this was a strange move by Capcom, because when they said they released it to appeal to the thousands of players who used Guy in the arcade, I thought this was a wind-up. I never knew anyone who used Guy in the arcades. It was always Cody and Hagar, but I guess each to their own. Due to hardware limitations, the SNES version could only display 2 or 3 enemies on screen, in contrast to the arcade version, which could display up to 9 or 10 enemies on screen. To make up for this difference, the SNES version features more stopping points than the arcade version, and the enemy placement is vastly different. Also, the SNES version was missing an entire level. The industrial zone was removed altogether. This was a level that in the arcades was a real pain to go through, but I guess Mayor Hagar quickly got to work and offshored those jobs, meaning that there is no industrial areas anymore. What a mayor. Gets elected and thanks you all by laying off loads of workers. No wonder he wasn't popular with the Mad Gear gang. Even with these restrictions in place within the game, with only 3 enemies on screen at once, the game suffered from terrible slowdown. Final Fight Guy did not suffer as bad for this. Evidence of Capcom developers getting to grips with the SNES hardware, I imagine. The slowdown was a sore point. It didn't completely ruin the game or anything, but it did lessen the playability of the game a little. Something I have to get off my chest here is this. At the time of its release on the SNES, it was slated as only ever having 3 enemies on screen at any one time. But if you go back and play Golden Axe on the arcades or the Mega Drive, it's the exact same thing, only 3 enemies on screen. The fact the arcade game had so many enemies on screen seemed to be enough ammunition to some to dismiss Final Fight on the SNES as some terrible game, when in fact it wasn't. It was by no means close to the arcade version, but on the SNES it was a good game. It was fun to play and still challenging enough with only 3 enemies on screen. And Hagar still done his silly condom putting on jump, which I still find funny. As mentioned before, this is one of my all-time favourite games, so which version do I play? Well, I play the arcade game. For all the faults of the SNES version, it still is a good game, but the arcade is the most complete version of this game. The challenge, the playability, the lack of slowdown, and all the characters' levels in 2-player mode, it's a no-brainer. Even years after this game's release, I would still play this in the arcades when I've seen it. Until I bought my own Final Fight Jammer board so I could play it at home. This was a bargain as well, at only £55 in 1997. It was only marginally more expensive than the Super NES release. In closing, Final Fight was a masterclass at what was possible for the scrolling beat-em-up genre. It took Double Dragon and kicked its ass into the dust, and would not be bettered for several years. But more than that, it gave Capcom the impetus to improve on the fight mechanics even more, and this would reveal itself only a year later. But that's a video for another time. That's all from me, folks. If you like this video, then please feel free to like, comment and subscribe. Thanks for watching.